Hi, I'm Lauren Henley, and I'm here to talk about my newest book, Inquisition for Blood, The Making of a Black Female Serial Killer in the Jim Crow South. Just want to say thank you to everybody for streaming and tuning in. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this project by sharing some slides and telling you more about how I came to the project and what all it means. So hopefully everybody can see my slides. And I want to say from the outset, I'm a historian by training, but I'm currently an assistant professor of leadership studies at the University of Richmond. And Inquisition for Blood is really an overview of a series of murders that took place in the Rice Belt region of the United States from November 1909 until August of 1912, and it follows both the crimes themselves and the individual who was blamed for the vast majority of them, despite some temporal inconsistencies. And so I thought it would be a good idea to tell you about how I came to this project and how long ago it first started, a little bit about my research process as a historian, the goals I have for the book, and, well, because it's a book about a serial killer or someone who was suspected of being one, of course, I'm going to tell you about the murders themselves, but not too much, with the hopes that you're interested in reading the book too. So the way I came to this project is actually kind of serendipitous. When I was a college student, I first learned about Black female juvenile reformatories. These are institutions throughout the South that were for young Black girls and women who were supposedly individuals who had committed some sort of criminal act. And often these were criminal acts related to autonomy or sexuality, things like sex work, gambling, staying out unchaperoned, going to a picture show or a dance hall, something of that sort. And what bothered me about these institutions was that of the ones I looked at, which were in Missouri, North Carolina, and Virginia, it seemed really, really odd that a young girl, say 7 years old, could be at the same institution as a young woman who was 22. So I started to ask myself, what is the role of age in how young Black women and girls get criminalized? Why is it that we can have these institutions that are really regulating young girls and women's autonomy? And what ultimately happens when they're charged with crimes that aren't about autonomy or sexuality, but are instead particularly violent? And I thought, well, what's more violent than murder, perhaps even serial murder? And so that was in the back of my mind at the same time that my advisor was starting a project on Black women who commit infanticide. And so, as luck would have it, as we were trying to build a data set of Black women who had killed their children, we stumbled upon somebody who, on first pass, seemed to have killed a lot of children. And her name was Clementine Barnabet. And very quickly, we realized these weren't her children. She was reportedly 19 years old. There were a lot of kids involved, and there were more than kids. There were adults as well. And from there, I started to ask myself, can we imagine a Black female serial killer, particularly one who is young? And so I had these projects and these ideas in the back of my mind, and it took me a while to get around to studying Clementine specifically. I dabbled in the reformatories, I dabbled in Black women as the victims of serial killers, a little bit about Black children as victims of violent crimes. I then decided I could eventually tackle Clementine and really get at the core of this project. And so I did that in a couple ways. And I tend to think about my research process as twofold. One is as a historian, and the second is as a detective. And as a historian, I do what we're trained to do. I go into the archives and I go looking for lots of primary source materials, censuses, city directories, maps, newspapers, all of that kind of stuff. And what I realized as a historian is that there are a couple of really big methodological issues with studying serial murder and having this sort of omnipotent or bird's eye view of the past. One is very practical. The phrase serial killer did not exist in English at the time period that I write about. So I had to get creative with how to find someone who we would all collectively understand as a serial killer today. Two is the fact that the first person or victim of a serial killer is never known to be the victim of a serial killer until there are other crimes. That's why it's a series. And so it means that the first crime is always investigated very differently. And that's true in the past and it's true today. And it requires really thinking intentionally about how to find the next crime and the next crime and the next crime. And then lastly, for my own research, is the question of how do we as historians really capture what I coin as sustained terror over time? How is it that when I look at records from, say, 1909 all the way to 1912, I know how the story ends? And how do I pay respect to the people in the past who did not know and could not know how the story would end? There's something not just unknown, but unknowable about serial murder that I really try to unpack in the book. And to do that requires thinking like a detective. And what I mean by that is, as I said, getting really creative with how I identified additional crimes, but also physically visiting every crime scene as it stands today and really trying to understand how someone could have stood there in the dark of the night 100+ years ago and decided to kill an entire family and, for the longest time, seemingly get away with it. When possible, I contacted descendants of all of the families in a way to both do sort of ethical justice to the project and make sure that I was representing their loved ones and their community fairly, but also so that oral history could serve as another avenue to understand the past. I did go trapezing through various cemeteries throughout the South to try to pay respect to those who were killed by either Clementine, the axman, or some other unknown assailant, and really tried to understand how serial murder functioned in the past. And so using my lens as a historian and as a detective has allowed me to reach some pretty fascinating conclusions about what was going on in the Rice Belt region at this time. And what I did was ask myself, so what? Who cares? Who cares if there was a Black female serial killer in the past? Why is this story relevant beyond a niche sort of true crime thing? And what I realized is that we haven't really grappled as scholars, or maybe even as a broader public, with understanding and acknowledging what happens when young Black women are actually capable of a range of human behaviors, from really, really good things to really, really bad things. And I think this comes out in a really basic question. Can any of us name a Black female serial killer? And typically the answer is no. And yet recent calls in social media and beyond to believe Black women, to me, issue us a challenge. And that challenge asks, can we believe the best and the worst of Black women? And that's a radical ask, especially within scholarship on Black women's criminality. And yet I think a case like Clementine's offers us that challenge, because there's a chance that Clementine did exactly what she said she did, no more and no less. There's a chance that Clementine did nothing she said she did. And my book allows for that too. But there's also the chance that Clementine did more than she said she did. And all of those things are possible within the story that I try to tell. And so when we look at acknowledging young Black women as capable of a range of human behaviors, then I suggest that there are at least 3 ways that I'm trying to offer an intervention. One is sort of methodological, and it's related to crimes. And I want to know if maybe we as historians can reconceptualize how we study serial murder. As I said, the words themselves get dicey at this point in time, but also understanding the acts first, as opposed to the people, might uncover more historic serial killers, particularly Black women and maybe even Black men, than have previously been uncovered. Second is understanding how inter and intra-racial violence coexisted in the Jim Crow South. And there's been phenomenal research on interracial violence in the Jim Crow South. And increasingly, there's more research on intra-racial violence. But these are communities in the Rice Belt that really had to grapple with both of these threats, the threat of, say, lynching and the threat of the axman at the same time. And there's lots of evidence to show how they balanced and negotiated those prospects in ways that ultimately prioritized the survival of their communities. And then lastly, why is it that in 1912 America, a Black female serial killer was not just possible, but probable, was really conceivable in American society? And yet today, we struggle to name a serial killer who isn't, say, stereotyped as a hyper-intelligent white man. Does this mean that things were different then, that the possibilities of what Black women were capable of doing and being perceived as doing was different? Or was the media really, really good at crafting a story about Clementine? Or both? And so that's how I've approached Inquisition for Blood. But as I said, I also think it's important to tell you about the crimes themselves. So let's get into what happened. And again, I'm not going to give away all of the nitty-gritty details and all of the suspects in the hopes that you want to read the story. Up first, the Opelousas family was murdered in Rayne, Louisiana in November of 1909. And you'll see as I go through these crimes that I'm going to put up the victim count as well. And in this case, there were 4 individuals who were killed, a mother and her 3 children. They were all killed with an axe in the back of her father's house, less than a mile from the Sunset Route of the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks. In this case, the family was also attacked with a knife, which was later located nearby. The axe was found in the aftermath of the scene as well. The Opelousases were your everyday Black family in rural Louisiana. And then a couple months later, the Hodge family was attacked in Lake Charles, Louisiana. This is just a little bit west of Rayne. And in this case, there were 2 victims, Minnie Hodge and her young son. Now, in this particular case, there was actually a 3rd individual, her husband, Elijah, who was away at work at a local sawmill about 7 miles upriver and came home to find his wife and baby boy deceased. The Hodge family was killed with an axe that was located in the house, and they were also attacked with smoothing irons, which are heavy cast irons used at this point for cleaning clothes. Fast forward almost a year, and the Byers family is axed in Crowley, Louisiana, which is not far from Rayne at all. In this case, a husband, a wife, and their young child were killed with an axe on a main thoroughfare of the Black part of West Crowley. And at this scene, there is bloody water left at a basin in the bedroom, suggesting that the killer was not in a particular rush in order to leave. Fast forward about a month, the Andrews family is attacked in Lafayette, Louisiana. Here, we've got 4 individuals, a husband, a wife, and their 2 children, who are murdered with an axe that is also found readily available in the house in the aftermath. This is the first time in which, if this is all the same killer, this individual decided to posthumously position the bodies, and they placed the husband and wife as if they were praying over a bed, and then positioned the children around them. Again, not in a rush to vacate the scene. Then the killer crossed the state lines into Texas, and the Castaway family was murdered. Not only did they cross the state lines, this is the first and only time that this assailant crossed the color line. Elizabeth Castaway, pictured here, was a white woman, but she had married a Black man. In fact, they had had to get married in Mexico due to anti-miscegenation laws in Texas. And so when they returned and started a family in San Antonio, they lived in a very diverse area, but by all accounts lived their lives as a Black family. The Castaway family was murdered with an axe, again, found nearby, and it appeared as if some of the bodies were thrown in the aftermath of the crimes. Then the killer crossed back to Louisiana to attack the Randall family in Lafayette. This is the second time that Lafayette had been visited by this unknown assailant at this point. And in this case, we have the highest victim count so far of 6 individuals, including a husband, a wife, their children, and an overnight guest of the children. In this case, the Randall family is attacked with an axe that is again readily located nearby, but the husband is also shot with a gun at point blank range. So far, we have in every crime scene an axe being used, as well as some sort of supplemental behavior, be it a weapon or posthumous positioning of bodies. In this case, after the husband is shot, the children's bodies are stacked at the edge of a bed as well. And I will say, and I'll talk about it in just a little bit, that it is at this crime scene where Clementine is first arrested and where she confesses, although that is often not the public image of her first confession. And even though she's arrested, the crimes continue. The Warner family is killed in Crowley, again, the second time that this town has been visited at the beginning of the new year. And in this case, it is a mother and her children who are murdered with an axe. And there's evidence to suggest that their bodies are dragged from one room of the house to another after they are killed. After the Warners are killed, it is only a matter of days before the Broussard family is killed in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Again, the second time that the city is visited. In this case, they are killed with an axe that is again found nearby. But what is particularly unique about the Broussard family crime is that in the aftermath, a biblical inscription is found on their front door that reads, "When he maketh inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble." And that's a permutation of Psalm 9:12, but it did lend a little bit of credence to the fact that Clementine had said that the crimes were religiously motivated. And here was a very religious inscription that was found in the aftermath. So again, a family, a father, a mother, and their 3 children are killed. And then the crimes cross back into Texas, where the Dove family is killed in Beaumont. And it's roughly a month later, they're killed with an axe. I will say for the Dove family that one unique thing about this crime scene is that all of the children in this scene are much older than the children in all of the other scenes. So that's something to pay attention to. I'm happy to answer any sort of question or thoughts about whether that's a copycat crime. After the 4 members of the Dove family are killed, then the killer continues in Texas to Glidden, which is a railroad stop that is literally only designed to service trains for the Southern Pacific Railroad. So it's a really, really tiny railroad town. They're killed in March. The Monroe family has 6 members, including a boarder who is staying with the family to help them make ends meet. In this case, their axe is found nearby, and the blade of it is clean, as if the killer has taken their time to kind of clean up the crime scene. Next, the Burton family is killed in San Antonio. And this is important because it happens after Clementine has confessed for a second time. And in her second confession, she said that the crimes were going to continue and that they were going to continue to push further and further west. And it seems as if that's exactly what happened. The Burton family was killed with an axe, and all of the adult members of the family had knives stabbed into them as well, like butcher knives and kitchen knives. A couple of days later, the Marshall family was attacked in Hempstead, Texas, and this is the very first time that people survive either the axman or whoever this elusive assailant is. 2 people do perish, one immediately and one a couple of days later, but 4 individuals do survive this crime scene. And then finally, the Dashiell family is attacked in San Antonio in August of 1912. Every member of the Dashiell family survives. And I have chatted with the descendants of the youngest child who was in the house at that time, and I'm happy to tell you about what they said happened that particular night. So those are the crimes. In total, there are 50 fatalities and 10 non-fatal assaults spanning 400 miles between November 1909 and August 1912. Again, a lot of these crimes are attributed to Clementine, but she was physically behind bars and unable to wield those axes for more than half of these crimes. But as I said, I tend to think about this like a detective and like a historian. And so there are some commonalities that are worth pointing out, even with all of the inconsistencies with Clementine's story. As I said, I spent a lot of time trying to connect the dots. And I want to be clear, there are plenty of axe murders that happened in the Rice Belt during these years that do not share these commonalities and are therefore not a part of this sequence that I'm writing about. But there are some key things that make these kinds of axe murders very different than others. As I mentioned, all of the crimes, with the exception of one, were committed not just along railroads, but along specifically the Sunset Route of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and within a mile, most of them within half of a mile of the railroad tracks themselves. And so outside of the crime in Hempstead, which is not along the Sunset Route, but is along a subsidiary of the Southern Pacific Railroad, this proximity to this particular line, I think, is worth paying attention to. Also, the axe is readily located nearby in all but one of the scenes. And these are common pole axes that people would have access to in cutting firewood and things of that sort. There is often, there are often multiple victims, but at minimum, there's always a mother and her child among the slain. Again, the Hodge family is the only time in which there are only 2 victims. And there's debate about whether or not Elijah Hodge could have been home or maybe should have been home then and simply was at work instead. In most of the crime scenes, it's a mother and multiple children, or a mother, a father, and multiple children. So very, very high victim count going on here, not just a single person. As I said, with the exception of Elizabeth Castaway, these are all Black families that are killed within their own homes. So there are plenty of axe murders that are happening at this point in which the victims are found in public places, or they're found outside of their residences or at other people's residences, businesses, things of that sort. These crimes are unique in that somebody is breaking into people's houses and they're killing them as they're asleep. And then lastly, there are some kinds of signatures that are happening. And signatures, in the parlance of criminal investigators, are things that killers do that are representative of them, but not necessary to carry out the crime itself. So these are their special marks that will often differentiate them from somebody else. And there are 2 big signatures that appear with these crimes. One is the use of secondary weapons like knives, guns, smoothing irons, that kind of thing. And then the second is posthumous positioning of bodies, of water vessels, basins, things like that. None of that needs to be done in order to commit these crimes. After all, everybody is fatally killed with an axe, but whoever did this took the time to engage in these other practices as well. So for me, I try to make the case that all of these crimes are related, or that people at the time believed that they were related, and that that is an important way to understand sustained terror over time. And if they are all related, well, then we have to look at Clementine's confessions. As I mentioned, she confessed in the aftermath of the Randall family murder. And this original confession was a curious one, admittedly. She was taken to New Orleans and given a 3rd-degree examination by the police department there, meaning that she was tortured. And at that point, she admitted to killing the Randall family and the Andrews family, the 2 families that were slain in Lafayette, which is where she was from and where she lived at that point in time. She did name religion as a motive and said that she killed the families because they refused to obey church orders. After she named religion as a motive, and after this confession, she remained behind bars, and yet the crimes continued, including, as I mentioned, the death of the Broussard family with the biblical inscription left on their front door. As the crimes continued throughout the spring of 1912, local communities dubbed this assailant the Axman, because they didn't have another way to think about the killer. In April of 1912, at the beginning of the month, Clementine reconfessed, even though she, again, was still behind bars. At this point, she added two more families to her victim roster: the Opelousas family that had been killed in Rain in November 1909, and the Byers family that had been killed in Crowley in early 1911. Importantly, the crime she took credit for occurred in a 25-mile radius of where she lived, as opposed to all 400 miles of the crimes that I write about. And Clementine predicted that the crimes would continue, as I mentioned, and indeed they did. So, did she know something? Was she bluffing? It's really hard to say. What matters is that after her April 1912 confession, obviously, the authorities tried to charge her with murder. Again, the crimes did continue beyond this point, but machinations within the local legal system had it such that she was indicted by the grand jury in Lafayette the day after news of the Dashiell family attack broke in San Antonio. At that point, she was tried in October 1912, and for various reasons, she was originally tried for just one count of murder, and that was the death of Azima Randall, who was the wife of Norbert Randall of the Randall family. Originally, Clementine's lawyers tried to have her declared insane, and so a lunacy commission was formed in order to investigate her fitness to stand trial. Her lawyers decided that despite this commission, there was no way that she was ever going to be found insane. She was found to be morally depraved, but sane enough to understand her actions and therefore sane enough to stand trial. During her trial, various people offered some pretty damning testimony against her, and the prosecution was determined to convict her without her confessions, without any sort of admission from her. Against the wishes of her attorneys, Clementine caused a bit of a ruckus in the middle of her trial when she said, "I am the axwoman of the sacrifice sect. I killed them all, men, women, and babies, and I hugged the dead babies to my breast, but I am not guilty of murder." No matter what Clementine thought she had done, in the eyes of a secular law, killing people is murder, even if it's done in a supposedly religious framework. So, did not take the jury long to convict her of a life sentence. So, convict her guilty of murder. She was given a life sentence without capital punishment and whisked away to Angola or the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Importantly, she stayed there for not that long. Indeed, after roughly a decade behind bars, Clementine was released from prison. And this might seem incredulous to us today, but this was very, very common. In fact, the 10-6 law in Louisiana at this point in time allowed prisoners to earn an incredible amount of good time credits, such that a life sentence roughly equated to 10 and a half years behind bars if someone survived that long. She was released at that point. She would have been roughly in her early 30s or so, and her whereabouts remain unknown. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and see what questions folks have about the book or my process or anything that you want to know about serial murder. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lauren. I'm still kind of reeling in. That was a fascinating presentation. I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, 12 years, like a decade that, sorry, like all of it is just really insane. We've got a lot of great questions for you already ready, but I do want to let everyone know that's tuning in that if you have a question for Lauren, please just put it in the chat and we will ask her live. Lauren also is tuning in from Zoom, so she cannot see your comments or questions. So if you want to say hi, where you're tuning in from, or anything, put it in the chat and I'll make sure to let her know. I want to go ahead and thank a couple people for tuning in. Thank you, Theodore, for tuning in from, is it Pulaski County? Maybe I'm saying that wrong, Virginia. I want to thank Stephen for tuning in from Baltimore and Lisa from tuning in from Hattiesburg. Lisa, I see your question and I'm going to get to that in a second, but I would like to start a little bit about asking you Lauren, what it was like talking to the Dashiell family.
Yeah, so the Dashiell family, they are amazing. And what I did was meet with them on Zoom. This is right at the tail end of the pandemic. And they are the children of the youngest child who was 10 years old when their family was attacked by the Axman. Importantly for the Dashiells, they're the last family in San Antonio that's attacked. They're the last victims of the Axeman, the only ones that totally survive. And they were close friends with the other San Antonio families. So I learned that their understanding of watching their neighbors and their friends be murdered really did impact the way that they thought about their lives. So the Dashiells had already decided that they were going to move away from San Antonio, and they were in the process of packing their house and moving out to California. They, the parents, had secured jobs out there. There was some belief that the father was being targeted for some political engagement in Texas, and they decided that San Antonio was not the place for them anymore. They also believed that they had been attacked by the Axeman before, earlier in June, when somebody had come to the family's house and seemingly tried to break in. At that point, they knew what was going on. These communities had been living under siege for years, and they were ready. Right? And so when they believed that the Axeman had come back a couple of months later, again, they're already planning to move. They have belongings out of the house. They are frazzled. This person breaks into the house late at night. Lula, who is the mom, and her 15-year-old daughter, Harriet, are sleeping in the same bed. Lula has her arm up over the top of her face. And so the axe comes down on her forearm, and she screams. But again, the family thought they had been attacked before. So immediately, the men in the household, the husband, the older sons, jump up and grab shotguns. And they just start shooting. And this person runs out of the house. And according to family lore, they believe that they saw a trail of blood leaving the house, kind of trailing away down the street. But when the authorities came, they said they saw nothing. And I tried to ask them, well, why the differences in these stories? Newspapers do not report that the assailant was shot, and there's no coverage of that. And they said, no, we're a Black family in Jim Crow America. To have shot at somebody, potentially a white person, because they firmly believe that the assailant was white, would have been a death sentence. Right? And so for the Dashiells, whoever did this was white men. They're very, very confident about that. And particularly two white men who had come by their house previously to inquire about some dogs that they owned, some greyhounds that they owned. And the greyhounds were found dead the next day. And then a couple days later, the family is attacked. And so for them, it's very much a racial thing. They were already going to leave. Right? They had seen their loved ones and their family members and friends all really, really traumatized by this experience. And so the fact that they thought that they got the person and the crime stopped and they left and moved to California and built a new life, I think is a really quirky kind of end to the Axeman saga. And so I do include their story as an appendix because I think it's a really important way to potentially put together all of these crimes. And it could very well have been two white men. That's totally their truth, and I think it's worth honoring.
Wait, so if I'm getting this right, you're
Yep.
saying that because this is obviously the last like murder, right?
Yeah.
So it was like they had shot at the two white men, but then just sort of like they were like, we don't want the police involved in this at
Yes.
all. So
Yes.
let's just kind of dispose of these bodies and then move along with our life.
Yeah. They don't know if the men died, right? So they were not
Right.
involved in what happened. That supposedly whoever was in the house ran away injured. And they literally packed their belongings the next day and hopped a train to California. So they were planning to stick around for a couple more days to wrap up loose ends in San Antonio, and instead said it's not worth it because perhaps we just shot some white men to death. So instead of facing that, they just left. They left everything. They left unfinished business. They left property. They left all kinds of stuff. And the family never returned.
I have a lot of questions to get into. That's honestly made me think about a lot of stuff that I want to ask. But I first want to get to Lisa, your question. but I also want to mention that we have a couple comments in the chat. So Marianne, thank you for tuning in from Baton Rouge. And Amy Smith-Torek says, thank you from the Learning Resource Center at Chattahoochee Valley Community College in Phoenix City, Alabama. We can't wait to read your book. Amy, thanks so much for tuning in. Lisa wants to know, were the investigators all white?
Yes,
I
they
feel like
were
that's
with a slight. So yes, all the investigators were white. There was a brief stint of time in which the white sheriff of Behar County, Texas, which is where San Antonio is located, John Tobin, deputized a number of Black men to serve as de facto policemen in Black neighborhoods in San Antonio in the spring of 1912. Because according to Sheriff Tobin, the local county sheriff's office and then the San Antonio Police Department were inept at trying to prevent the axman from coming into San Antonio. And at that point, Sheriff Tobin almost lost his job for deputizing Black men because it was an election year and he basically overstepped, or I should say, San Antonio Police Department thought he overstepped his boundaries by coming in as county sheriff to tell the city police that they were inefficient at keeping their citizens safe, and then deputized, like 6 Black men. It was not a bunch. But he ended up actually having to face a grand jury for that decision, for choosing to tell these Black men that they could be armed in their communities trying to keep their loved ones safe. So yes, only the investigators were white, but a very, very brief stint of some Black lawmen in San Antonio for a couple of weeks to try to keep the Black communities from really, really like losing it over the Axeman.
I feel like that just detail is such a good kind of embodiment of kind of like if we think about just Jim Crow as this great thing where like here's one great of an examples. I want to
Yeah.
get into a question from James Wilson, who, if you don't know, is our marketing and sales manager here at LC Press. James had a lot of questions for you, but this one I think is where I kind of want to start. He'd like to know if you could speak a little bit about Clementine's age at the time that she supposedly committed the murders, because he thinks maybe it's one of the more questionable elements of her guilt.
Yeah. So thanks, James. So Clementine's age is really varied in the records, right? So I tend to keep her at about 19 for her confessions, which would mean that if she confessed at 19, the Rain murder would have been committed when she was perhaps 17. And if you just kind of do the math, maybe even as early as 16, depending on her birthday. And so, yes, there is absolutely some debate there about whether or not a 16-year-old Black girl would be physically capable of wielding that axe. An axe is not exactly a light instrument, and whether or not at that age, things like brain development, family background, all of that kind of stuff would play into perhaps a false confession, especially knowing that the New Orleans Police Department did not treat her kindly. And so when I write about her confessions, I'm very careful to explain why they could have been false, particularly why under duress, we have pretty good psychology research today to show that young people are more apt to make a false confession than older people. And it has to do with brain development. It has to do with an inability to understand long-term consequences. And so the thought of, I could get out if I just say I did it and then deal with this later, is often why we see things like the Central Park jogger case and confessions, false confessions from juveniles. And so in my work, I went and consulted experts on juvenile false confessions to make sure that I was capturing what was possible for Clementine without minimizing the fact that she could have done it. And so even at 16, there are unfortunately plenty of 16-year-olds who do commit murder. And so I try to balance that out in that chapter by explaining it's totally possible, but it's all fabricated. And she was a scared young girl who was just miles away from home and under a really difficult situation. It's also possible that she did exactly what she said she did and was fully aware and playing into assumptions about her age in order to make it seem like she wasn't capable. So
While
either one
we're
is possible.
so sorry.
No, you're right.
While we're on the subject, I do want to talk about Clementine's family, but first, I want to read a comment from David Dixon in the chat who says, crazy story. Thanks for sharing it. And thank you, David, for tuning in. So this is another question from James. He'd like to know if you can speak to the fact that Clementine's dad was arrested and convicted of the murders before she actually became a suspect. And he says it was largely based on her testimony. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. So I did not cover that in my short synopsis, in part because there's a lot I didn't cover. This story gets messy. But yes, Clementine's dad, Raymond, was actually charged and convicted of killing the Andrews family. The thing about Raymond is that diplomatically, he was not a likable man. People in the local Lafayette community did not think highly of him, or for that matter, the Barnabet family. And it seems like at minimum he was unlikable. Likely he was abusive towards his common law wife, Dinah, abusive towards his children, seemingly had a very bad temper. And so what ended up happening is that following the murder of the Andrews family, Raymond was a suspect, again, unlikable guy. The authorities at that point do not have enough evidence to keep him, and so they release him. Over the summer, he is rearrested, and at that point, they seemingly have some more evidence against him. So he goes to trial in October of 1911. So exactly a year before his daughter goes to trial. And Raymond does not meet with his attorneys, or they don't meet with him. Hard to really know what's going on. They do try to get his trial delayed because they have heard from the prosecution that there are some star witnesses that they don't know who they are. The judge denies that request and the trial proceeds. When Raymond gets to court is when he learns that the star witnesses are his own family members. It is his common law wife, Dinah, it is Clementine, and it is his son, Zephyrin. At that point, he knows he's facing potentially death if he's convicted of these crimes, and the people who are testifying against him are his loved ones. So the prosecution testifies first, and even though Dinah, Clementine, and Zephyrin all give contradictory testimony, they basically place him not at home on the night the Andrews family is murdered. They say that he's hopped a train to Broussard, which is a nearby town, and that he basically returns at some point between early morning hours and well after the sun is up, and he's perhaps missing his shirt, he's maybe missing his pipe, he's cursing, he has blood stains on him, and they give all this contradictory testimony, and they basically say Raymond did it. He watches this happen, and the court adjourns for lunch. He's whisked back to his jail cell where he passes some money to a local passerby who goes promptly to the saloon and gets him a fifth of Spurton wine, which is just really strong alcohol. He downs that fifth flat, returns to his trial, so drunk he can't understand what's happening. And according to Louisiana law, even though he is convicted of murder, because he cannot understand where he is, he cannot understand the finality of his sentence, he's actually going to be given a retrial. So, because he doesn't know what's going on. He's like too drunk. He's asking to go to the bathroom. He's muttering Creole phrases under his breath that basically mean like, I'm damned. And so the jury convicts him, but he literally doesn't know where he is. He's watched his family testify his life away. And even though he's seemingly, again, an unlikable man, the court process is the court process. And there are some procedural things. Again, their testimony is contradictory, right? And so his lawyers argue for a retrial, and that's granted. So he stays in jail while all of the other murders happen. Eventually, he gives a statement to a reporter that he believes Clementine is guilty. And then eventually, finally, when she's convicted, he is released and he just kind of disappears in the wind. So at minimum, they have a contentious relationship. Like her home life is not a good one, probably a very, very bad one, if I'm honest, and clearly doesn't have a good relationship with her dad either. So yes, Raymond was indeed charged and convicted of the Andrews family murder, but was too drunk for that charge to stand.
The more I learn about this, my mouth just keeps staying open the whole time.
Crazy.
I want to talk about the news.
Yeah,
So these these events take place. It starts in what you said, 1910 or 1911?
1909 is the first one.
1909.
Yeah,
So we're kind of just past what we know as like the yellow journalism era.
yeah.
And I'm just kind of interested in how newspapers are playing a role and how this story is disseminated and maybe fictionalized in some ways. And in your experience as an investigator and a historian, as you say, how you were kind of fighting against that.
Yeah, so newspapers play a huge role in both my research and the way that the news circulates. So I have more than 3,000 newspaper articles about these crimes. And what's really important is that Clementine's name does not appear in a lot of them, because again, you don't know who a serial killer is until you do. But there are crimes that eventually get associated with that person. And so I was very careful to really parse out newspapers that are sharing the same information and tracing that back to, say, a single news wire, like the AP wire or the INS or something like that, versus what local newspapers were saying about a given crime. And the best way I can describe it is as sort of concentric circles, where whatever was closest to the crime scene tended to be more reliable than things that got further and further away from the crime scene. And so, like San Antonio had two daily papers that sent reporters to the crime scenes like that morning. And therefore, I would go looking through those San Antonio papers for X number of weeks after the murders to see follow up information and then go corroborate it with court records, transcripts, things of that sort, archival materials. And then I might go encounter something entirely unrelated in like Idaho that says something that's entirely fabricated about the San Antonio crimes. Right? And so I was very careful to see, again, what wires were circulating information and then where those newspapers were located to figure out what things were true. That's part of how there are lots of reports of believing that the crimes are voodoo related, but those reports don't actually exist in central or southwestern Louisiana and southeastern Texas. They come from Michigan, Vermont, Virginia, places that one don't actually know what voodoo is, right? And are also really, really big about just selling newspapers. So I separate those things out. The other thing is that news travels quickly, perhaps faster than people realize. And so often newspapers are reflecting back what communities have already determined to be true. So it's the newspapers that report that local Black communities have figured out effectively that this is a serial killer before law enforcement officials ever reach that conclusion. And it's because Black folks are talking, right? Their loved ones are down the street in a neighboring town. They're hopping the train for work or for pleasure. That's how that information is circulating. And so in some cases, the newspapers are actually part of getting the information out faster than law enforcement officials can actually solve the cases.
Well, I have a follow-up question about that.
Yeah,
I have two actually.
yeah.
The first one is it's about news coverage specifically from Black media outlets, with the caveat that this is Jim Crow. So obviously, at this point, a lot of Black media outlets have been like deinstitutionalized. But was there a difference in coverage from Black media outlets than white media outlets at the time?
So only about 1% of the newspaper articles I have are from Black newspapers. Part of that, I think, is because they just don't exist, as in the newspapers went defunct and I don't have records of them, and I've tried to find records of them, and they're lost to nature. Two is that I kind of make the case that Black folks were terrified of what was going on. They were terrified of Clementine. They were terrified of the axman. They were terrified of the unknowable. And so white newspapers actually give a better sense of what Black communities were feeling because white folks thought that they were immune. So they didn't feel scared to report about what was going on. Black communities worried that basically they would be next. Like they could not figure out what things were prompting this person to attack. Because there was no, like, the victimology is multiple people, right? A mother and a child and some other folks in a house, but it's not as if they were targeting only older folks or only, I think there's a rumor that they were only targeting mixed race families or lighter Black families. That's not true. And so Black communities were actually really, really scared. And so Black newspapers didn't really report on this. I will say one caveat is that the Chicago Defender covered Clementine's case very briefly, and they're the only newspaper that called her just a silly girl. And the Defender is not particularly nice to Black women charged with crimes. They tended to promote a sort of Black middle class respectability politics. They had no problems describing Black women as Amazonian. And so the fact that Clementine got to be a girl in the most widely circulated Black newspaper of the time, I think is telling about how her age was fungible depending upon who thought she did it and who thought she didn't.
If you're just tuning in, we're doing a Q&A with Lauren Henley, who wrote this amazing and fascinating book, Inquisition for Blood. I've got a couple more questions lined up, and then we're gonna finish up by the end of the hour. So if you have a question for Lauren, now's the time to put it in the chat, and I will ask her. I want to talk a little bit. We've mentioned several times trains and train routes, and I do want to ask if you could speak a little bit to the importance of trains to these crimes, and in general, train usage, whether official or clandestine, for Black people during this time.
Yeah. So what's fascinating about the train is that, you know, some people have tried to suggest, well, trains were just so popular, axes were so popular, there was just like a surge of axe murders at this point in time, and everybody took the train. In my case is not this route. Not everybody took the Sunset route of the Southern Pacific Railroad. That is a very unique train route that originally went from New Orleans to San Francisco. And again, almost all of the murders, except for one, took place along that route in very close proximity. I've looked at the timetables. They all could have been done hopping the train legally, right, at the appointed times, including the murders that happened very close together, like that of the Dove family and the Broussard family. That's only 2 days apart. But also, if you just hop a train illegally, you just ride it, then you certainly can commit these crimes. And we do have some evidence to suggest that Clementine rode trains. Right? We do know that she gave a statement saying that she rode a train to Mississippi, working as a domestic at some point. She also, in one of her confessions, said that she and her accomplices, of which she said she had four, we can talk about whether that's true or not, but that they thought about committing crimes in other railroad towns in Louisiana, but decided that those towns were too small for them to potentially hop the train and then get away undetected. And so trains are a way of life at this point. When the Monroe family is killed in Glidden, Texas, the individuals who are originally suspects in that case were actually trying to get to a train station and they just missed the night train. So they were kind of heading back into town at the same time that the murders were happening. And so the local law enforcement agencies thought that maybe this couple was responsible for this murder. And so there are little moments in which the train pops up as just a way of life at this point. And I kind of try to make the case it's a technology, right? The amount of railroad tracks that get laid at this point from 1880 to 1920, astronomical in the US. And so as much as it brings people and goods and news and service to once unreachable places, it also is a way for someone who wants to engage in violent crime to get away undetected. And trains are really loud. So if you time axing somebody with the perfect passage of a train and that train is passing less than half a mile from your house, you might
You
actually
know,
get away with it.
it's true. I have so I have three questions left for you. I've got one larger question and two small questions, and I still think we'll get out of here um, by the end of the hour. I want to ask a little bit about the reaction. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that part of this is like a conceivability problem. It's like how can we conceive, or can we conceive of a Black female serial killer? So I want to talk about, you mentioned that within localized Black communities, there was kind of an earlier assumption that this is a serial killer. We know this is true, but once the serial killer was kind of unmasked as a Black woman, what were some of the reactions, kind of more nationally, if you could find anything with white and Black communities?
Yeah, so one thing that was reported in white newspapers was that following Clementine's indictment, that no Black people were going to attend her trial because they thought she had the evil eye, and therefore, supposedly, there were no Black folks at her trial. I don't think that that's true. I think that that's sensationalism. But I do think it is evidence to suggest that people thought she was powerful, not so powerful that they were not going to attend her trial, but people were genuinely scared of her, whether because they thought she did it or they thought she was crazy enough to confess to doing it. Like either one of those gives her a phenomenal amount of power. So I do think that in the sort of adage to believe Black women, someone like Clementine gets to be both what society makes her out to be, what the media makes her out to be, but we don't want to forget what she made herself out to be. She said she confessed, she said she killed 17 people with her bare hands. Do we believe that? Or do we say, wow, how bold to even utter that idea out loud, to even try to take credit for that? That's that's intense. That says a lot about her and the worldview that she had and who she wanted to be and what she was willing to claim as her identity. So yeah.
I think that's a beautiful place actually to end this conversation. And so I want to mention that if you want to hear more about the story, first and foremost, buy this book, which is available with a very generous 40% off discount pinned to the top of the chat. So if you don't have it yet, make sure to get it. If you are interested in reading just more from Lauren, I put in the chat an AMA for the very popular Reddit community called Ask Historians that Lauren did just the other day. So you can check that out. As an ending question, Lauren, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now that this book is out in the world? What's next?
Yeah, so what's next is I'm going to try to find another Black female serial killer and see if my method, the method to my madness, works. And as a teaser, I think I have one.
Oh my God.
So I will be exploring that this summer, and she's in Texas. So woohoo, Texas.
Well, I wish you the best of luck on that. I can't wait to see what comes next. Thank you again for just a really wonderful conversation and for sharing your wisdom and the great presentation. And thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. That's all we have for today. Before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to say, Lauren?
Just like to thank everybody for tuning in, and thanks to LSU Press for hosting this event.
All right. Until next time. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.